"Well, I'll be damned," muttered Jake Whitehorse, squinting through the Arizona heat shimmer at Highway 89. Traffic had backed up for nearly a mile, and it wasn't because of any fender bender he'd ever seen. A young bobcat, no bigger than a house cat, sat dead center in the southbound lane. Cars crept around her, drivers leaning out windows with their phones, snapping pictures. But this wasn't some confused animal wandering onto asphalt. This little wildcat had something strapped to her hind leg, and she was staring directly at Jake's patrol truck with eyes that seemed almost human. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Whitehorse," he radioed, never taking his eyes off the creature. "I'm gonna need animal control and maybe a vet out here. We got ourselves a situation that don't make a lick of sense." The bobcat stood up, took 3 deliberate steps toward his truck, then looked back toward the wilderness as if to say, "Follow me." Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 18 months earlier, Tommy Redfeather had been driving the back roads near Canyon de Chelly when he heard the crying. Not human crying, but something that tugged at his heart just the same. He pulled his battered Ford pickup to the shoulder and followed the sound into a grove of cottonwoods. What he found there nearly broke him. A mother bobcat lay motionless beneath a fallen branch, her spotted coat matted with blood. Beside her, a kitten no bigger than his fist mewed pitifully, nudging at her mother's still form with tiny paws. The little one's eyes had barely opened, and she was already facing a world without protection. "Oh, hell," Tommy whispered, kneeling beside them. He'd spent 15 years rehabilitating wildlife, but something about this scene felt different, personal even. The mother's golden eyes stared sightless at the sky, but her body was still positioned protectively around her baby. Even in death, she'd been trying to shield her child. Tommy's grandfather, Elder Joseph Thunderbird, had always said that some meetings weren't accidents. "The spirits got their own plans, boy," the old man would say, tobacco smoke curling around his weathered face. "Sometimes what looks like coincidence is just the universe setting things right." Looking at this orphaned kitten, Tommy felt that same mystical pull his grandfather had always talked about. Blood's thicker than water, sure enough, but love runs deeper than both. He wrapped the tiny bobcat in his jacket, feeling her heartbeat flutter against his palm like a captured bird. She was so small, so fragile, the rational part of his mind knew the odds were against her. Infant bobcats needed their mothers for survival skills he couldn't teach. But when those golden eyes opened and looked directly into his, Tommy felt something shift in his chest. "Well, little spirit," he murmured, the name coming to him unbidden. "Looks like it's just you and me now." The drive back to his cabin was the longest 20 minutes of his life. Spirit had stopped crying, but she trembled constantly, and Tommy found himself talking to her the whole way. Nonsense, mostly. Promises he wasn't sure he could keep. But by the time he pulled into his driveway, he'd already mentally rearranged his life around this tiny creature. That first night he barely slept. Every few hours he'd wake to feed her with an eyedropper, check her breathing, adjust the heating pad he'd rigged in an old dog crate. Spirit was a fighter, though. She took the formula eagerly, and her tiny claws gripped his finger with surprising strength. "You're gonna make it, aren't you?" he whispered during one of those midnight feedings. "Your mama raised herself a survivor." He had no idea then how prophetic those words would prove to be. The storm came out of nowhere on what should have been their last day together. Tommy had planned this final wilderness assessment carefully, 3 days in the backcountry near Sedona to evaluate whether Spirit was truly ready for release. At 18 months old, she'd mastered every survival skill he could teach her. She could hunt, navigate, and most importantly, she'd learned to fear humans appropriately. Well, most humans. When the storm hit, heaven and hell switched places, Tommy would later tell anyone who'd listen. though by then few people would doubt any part of his story. The morning had dawned clear and crisp, perfect weather for hiking the rugged terrain where Spirit would eventually make her home. She'd grown into a magnificent creature, 45 pounds of muscle and instinct, her spotted coat gleaming in the Arizona sun. But despite all her wild training, she still followed Tommy with the devotion of a dog, staying close enough to hear his voice, but far enough to maintain her independence. "This is it, girl," Tommy had said as they made camp the night before. "Tomorrow, we say goodbye." He'd tried to keep his voice steady, but Spirit seemed to sense something different in his tone. She'd pressed against his leg with unusual insistence, those golden eyes searching his face as if trying to read his thoughts. Tommy had been fighting symptoms for months, exhaustion that went bone deep, pain that gnawed at his ribs, a persistent cough that left him breathless. He'd told himself it was just stress, just the emotional weight of letting Spirit go. But deep down, he knew better. The same disease that had taken his father was announcing itself in his own body, and time was running short. The weather forecast had called for scattered afternoon showers. Instead, the sky split open like a broken dam just after noon. Lightning cracked overhead with the fury of angry gods, and the wind howled through the canyon walls with enough force to bend century-old pines. Tommy had weathered plenty of desert storms, but this one felt different, violent and personal, as if nature itself was protesting something. "Spirit," he called over the wind. "Come on, girl. We need shelter." She appeared at his side instantly, her ears flattened against the noise. Together they scrambled toward an overhang of red rock that promised protection. Tommy's boots slipped on the wet sandstone, but he caught himself, one hand on Spirit's back for balance. They'd made it maybe 50 yards when the lightning struck. The bolt hit a massive ponderosa pine directly above them. Tommy heard the crack, smelled the ozone, felt the heat wash over them like dragon's breath. Then the world went sideways as the tree came down. "Run!" he shouted, shoving Spirit away from him with all his strength. She tumbled down the slope, rolling through scrub brush and rocks, but she was clear, safe. That was all that mattered. Tommy wasn't so lucky. The pine caught him across the back and drove him down a steep embankment. He hit hard, felt something snap in his leg, then kept falling. Rocks tore at his clothes and skin as he bounced down 20 feet of jagged terrain before slamming into a boulder with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. When the world stopped spinning, Tommy found himself wedged between two massive stones in a narrow ravine. His right leg was bent at an angle that made his stomach lurch, and something hot and wet was running down his face. Worse, the fallen tree had followed him down, its massive trunk now pinning his legs against the rocks. "Spirit?" he called weakly. "Spirit, you okay, girl?" Her answer came as a desperate yowl from somewhere above. She was alive, but she couldn't reach him. The walls of the ravine were too steep, too slick with rain. Tommy tried to move and immediately regretted it. Pain shot through his body like electricity, and he could taste blood in his mouth. His backpack was somewhere upslope, along with his radio, his GPS, and any hope of calling for help. His cell phone was crushed beneath him, its screen spider-webbed beyond use. "Well," he said aloud, his voice echoing off the stone walls, "this is one hell of a pickle." The rain kept falling, turning the ravine into a shallow stream. Tommy could feel the cold water soaking through his clothes, leaching away his body heat. He'd been in survival situations before, but never like this. Never trapped, never injured this badly, and never with the knowledge that his body was already fighting a losing battle against cancer. Above him, Spirit paced along the rim of the ravine, her cries growing more frantic. She'd make quick forays down the slope, testing possible routes, but the wet rock defeated every attempt. Each failure seemed to drive her to greater desperation. "Easy, girl," Tommy called up to her, though his voice was getting weaker. "Easy now. Don't you go doing something stupid on my account." But even as he said it, he could see Spirit's intelligence working. She was problem-solving, analyzing the situation with an intensity that reminded him unnervingly of a human mind trapped in a wildcat's body. During their months together, he'd often marveled at her cognitive abilities, but now those same abilities were focused on an impossible task. Hours passed. The storm moved on, leaving behind a sky so clear it seemed to mock their predicament. Tommy's leg had gone numb, which he supposed was a mercy, but the cold was settling deep into his bones. He'd survived plenty of challenges in his 43 years, but hypothermia combined with internal bleeding was more than even his stubborn Cherokee blood could overcome. "Desperate times call for desperate measures," he whispered, remembering his grandfather's voice. It was something the old man had said during Tommy's darkest moments, usually followed by advice that seemed crazy until it worked. That's when the idea came to him. Desperate, impossible, but maybe their only chance. With shaking hands, Tommy managed to work his emergency beacon free from his belt. It was a simple GPS locator, the kind serious hikers carried in case of emergencies. But it was also designed to be attached to a person, not an animal. Still, Spirit was smart, smarter than any Bobcat had a right to be. "Spirit," he called, his voice cracking with effort. "Come here, girl. I need you to do something for me, something important." 6 months earlier, Tommy Redfeather had walked into Dr. Sarah Moonwalker's office believing he had pneumonia. He walked out knowing he was dying. "The hardest battles are fought in doctors' offices," his grandfather used to say, and Tommy finally understood what the old man meant. It wasn't the physical pain that cut deepest. It was the way hope could be murdered by medical terminology, executed with clinical precision by people who meant well, but had never learned to deliver death sentences gently. "Stage 3 pancreatic adenocarcinoma," Dr. Moonwalker had said, her dark eyes full of professional compassion. "I'm sorry, Tommy. I wish I had better news." Tommy stared at the X-rays on the light box, seeing his own mortality spelled out in shadows and contrast. The tumor looked like a storm cloud, dark and ominous, spreading through his body with malevolent purpose. Pancreatic cancer. The same disease that had taken his father 20 years ago, back when Tommy was fresh out of college and still believed the world made sense. "How long?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know. "With aggressive treatment, chemotherapy, possibly surgery, 18 months, maybe 2 years. Without treatment," she paused, choosing her words carefully, 6 months, maybe less. Tommy nodded, accepting the verdict with the same stoic calm his ancestors had shown when facing cavalry charges and government relocations. But inside, his mind was racing. 6 months. Spirit was barely a year old then, still learning to hunt, still depending on him for guidance and protection. 6 months wasn't enough time to properly prepare her for independence. "What does aggressive treatment look like?" he asked. Dr. Moonwalker launched into an explanation of chemotherapy protocols, surgical options, and survival statistics. The words washed over him like background noise while his real thoughts focused on a spotted bobcat who trusted him completely. How could he explain to her that he was abandoning her? How could he justify putting her through the trauma of watching him waste away in a hospital bed? "Doctor," he interrupted gently, "what about quality of life? How would I feel during treatment?" Her expression grew more guarded. "Chemotherapy is challenging. You'd experience significant fatigue, nausea, weight loss. Your immune system would be compromised. It's not easy, Tommy. Would I be able to work, take care of my animals? For a while, maybe. But eventually, no. You'd need to focus on treatment, on fighting this thing. Tommy closed his eyes, seeing Spirit's face in his mind. Those golden eyes that looked at him with absolute trust, absolute love. She'd already lost one parent. How could he put her through losing another, especially while he was too sick to comfort her? "A man's got to do what a man's got to do," he said finally, using one of his grandfather's favorite phrases. "But sometimes what a man's got to do isn't what everyone expects." Over the following weeks, Tommy wrestled with the decision. He researched pancreatic cancer obsessively, reading medical journals and survivor stories. The statistics were brutal. Even with treatment, 5-year survival rates hovered around 5%. The treatment itself was often worse than the disease, leaving patients debilitated and suffering for months before inevitable death claimed them anyway. But it was a conversation with Elder Joseph Thunderbird that finally helped him find peace with his choice. The old man had listened patiently while Tommy explained the diagnosis, the treatment options, the impossible decision he faced. In the old days, Joseph had said, smoke from his pipe curling between them, warriors who knew they were going to die got to choose how. Some chose to die fighting. Others chose to die teaching. A few chose to die loving. He'd fixed Tommy with those ancient eyes that seemed to see straight through to the soul. "Which warrior are you, grandson?" Tommy had his answer then. He wasn't going to die fighting a hopeless battle against cancer while Spirit watched him suffer. He wasn't going to die in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines and strangers. He was going to die loving, making sure Spirit was ready for independence, creating memories that would sustain them both through whatever came after. But keeping the secret proved harder than making the decision. Every morning, he woke up feeling the tumor's presence like a malevolent passenger in his chest. Every evening, as Spirit curled up beside him, he wondered if this would be one of their last nights together. The pain was manageable with over-the-counter medications, but the emotional weight was crushing. 3 months after the diagnosis, Dr. Moonwalker called to schedule a follow-up appointment. "Tommy, you've missed your last 2 appointments. I need to see you, assess how you're responding to—" "I'm not taking treatment," he interrupted. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several heartbeats. "Tommy, I understand this is overwhelming, but—" "Dr. Moonwalker, with respect, I've made my choice. I'm not changing my mind. At least let me prescribe pain medication, something to help with the symptoms as they progress. I'll think about it." But he wouldn't, and they both knew it. Tommy had watched his father die on a cocktail of morphine and false hope, drifting in and out of consciousness, while the family gathered around his hospital bed like mourners at a wake. That wasn't how Tommy wanted Spirit to remember him. Instead, he threw himself into her training with renewed intensity. They spent hours in the wilderness, working on hunting techniques, navigation skills, territory marking. He taught her to recognize dangerous situations, how to avoid humans, how to find water in drought conditions. Every lesson was delivered with the urgency of a man running out of time. Spirit seemed to sense the change in him. She became more attentive, more protective, often positioning herself between Tommy and perceived threats during their training sessions. When he had coughing fits, she'd press against his legs, offering comfort in the only way she knew how. Her intuitive understanding of his condition was both heartbreaking and remarkable. "She knows something's wrong," Tommy confided to Elder Joseph during one of their weekly visits. "Animals always know." "Maybe she knows more than you think," the old man replied cryptically. "Maybe she's preparing too." As the months passed, Tommy's symptoms worsened gradually. The pain in his abdomen became constant, manageable only through sheer willpower and meditation techniques his grandfather had taught him. His energy levels dropped, forcing him to take frequent rests during their wilderness excursions, but he persevered, driven by the knowledge that each day brought them closer to his deadline. The final wilderness assessment trip had been planned as a celebration. 3 days for Spirit to demonstrate her readiness for independence, followed by her release into the wild. Tommy had chosen the location carefully, a remote area near Sedona where she could establish territory without human interference. It was meant to be his gift to her: freedom, safety, and the knowledge that she was strong enough to survive on her own. What he hadn't planned for was the storm, the accident, the crushing weight of knowing that his careful preparations might amount to nothing if they both died in this ravine. All those months of training, all those lessons in survival, and it might end here, with Spirit watching helplessly as cancer and hypothermia claimed the only parent she'd ever known. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Tommy felt a strange sense of peace. He'd kept his promise to himself. He'd died loving, not fighting. Every moment of the past 6 months had been devoted to Spirit's welfare, to ensuring her future survival. If this was how it ended, at least she'd be free to remember him as strong, not as the wasted shell chemotherapy would have made him. Still, he wasn't ready to give up, not yet, not while Spirit needed him. 2 years earlier, Tommy Redfeather had been driving home from a failed job interview when his life changed forever. The position at the Phoenix Zoo had gone to someone with more formal education, despite Tommy's 15 years of hands-on wildlife experience. He'd sat in their sterile conference room, listening to them explain why his Cherokee heritage and intuitive understanding of animals couldn't compete with a master's degree in zoology. Angels don't always have wings. Sometimes they have claws, he would later tell anyone who'd listen, though back then he was too angry to see any divine intervention in what happened next. The rain had started just outside Flagstaff, turning the desert highway treacherous. Tommy's windshield wipers struggled against the downpour, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. He should have pulled over, should have waited it out at a truck stop, but his pride was wounded and he wanted to get home to his empty cabin where he could lick his wounds in private. The semi-truck came out of nowhere, hydroplaning across the median at 70 miles per hour. Tommy saw it in his peripheral vision, a massive wall of steel and momentum bearing down on his little Ford pickup. Time stretched like taffy as his mind processed the impossibility of survival. The physics were simple and brutal. 40 tons of truck versus his 3,000-pound pickup truck. There was no way he'd walk away from this. He yanked the steering wheel hard right, sending his truck skidding toward the shoulder. The semi clipped his rear bumper with enough force to send him spinning across the wet asphalt like a top. Tommy's truck rolled 3 times before slamming into a grove of cottonwoods with a sound like the world ending. When consciousness returned, he was hanging upside down in his seatbelt, blood dripping from his scalp onto the truck's interior roof. His left arm hung at a wrong angle, and something sharp was pressing against his ribs with every breath. The acrid smell of radiator fluid mixed with the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. But he was alive. Impossibly, incomprehensibly alive. That's when he heard the growling. Tommy twisted his head toward the sound and felt his blood freeze. A mountain lion, a big male, maybe 150 pounds, stood 20 feet away, its yellow eyes fixed on the overturned truck. Blood matted the cat's shoulder where a piece of flying debris had struck it, and its predatory gaze suggested it was looking for something to take its pain out on. Tommy fumbled for his seatbelt release with his good hand, knowing he had maybe seconds before the cat decided to investigate the wreckage more closely. But his fingers were slick with blood and the mechanism was jammed. He was trapped, helpless, about to become dinner for an injured and angry predator. The mountain lion took a step closer, then another, its muscles bunched under golden fur preparing to spring. Tommy closed his eyes and thought about his grandfather's stories of warriors who died with honor, fighting to the last breath. At least his death would have meaning in the old ways, even if no one would be around to sing about it. The attack came with a sound like thunder, but not from the mountain lion. Tommy's eyes snapped open to see a blur of spotted fur launch itself at the big cat. A female bobcat, half the mountain lion size but twice as fierce, hit the predator like a furry cannonball. The two cats rolled in a snarling ball of claws and fangs, the bobcat's desperate courage pitted against the mountain lion's superior size and strength. "No," Tommy whispered, understanding instantly what was happening. "No, don't do this." But the bobcat fought like a creature possessed, darting in to slash at the mountain lion's legs before dancing away from its powerful paws. She was protecting him, a stranger, a human she'd never seen before, and she was going to die for it. The battle lasted only minutes, but they felt like hours. The bobcat's speed and agility kept her alive longer than physics suggested possible, but the mountain lion's size and power were overwhelming. A lucky swipe caught her across the ribs, sending her tumbling into the brush. She struggled to her feet, blood staining her spotted coat, but her legs trembled with exhaustion. The mountain lion stalked toward her, sensing victory. But as it prepared for the killing blow, the sound of approaching sirens echoed across the desert. The big cat's head snapped up, ears swiveling toward the noise. After a moment's hesitation, it melted back into the undergrowth, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. Tommy finally managed to free himself from the seatbelt, dropping onto the truck's roof in a heap of pain and disbelief. He crawled through the shattered passenger window, dragging his broken arm, and stumbled toward where the bobcat lay motionless in the dirt. She was still breathing, but barely. Her golden eyes followed his movement as he knelt beside her, and Tommy felt his heart break at the intelligence he saw there. She'd known the fight was hopeless. She'd known she was sacrificing her life for his, and she'd done it anyway. "Why?" he whispered, gently stroking her blood-matted fur. "Why would you do that for me?" The bobcat's breathing grew more labored, but she managed to lift her head slightly. Behind her, hidden in a small depression beneath a fallen log, Tommy caught a glimpse of movement. A tiny spotted face peered out at him with enormous golden eyes, a kitten, maybe 3 weeks old, completely dependent on the mother who was dying to save a stranger. Understanding hit him like a physical blow. The bobcat hadn't just been protecting him, she'd been protecting her baby's future. In her animal wisdom, she'd somehow known that the human would care for her orphan child if she saved his life first. It was a gamble, born of desperation and love, a mother's final act of devotion. "A debt of honor ain't never forgotten," Tommy said, using his grandfather's words for promises too sacred to break. He reached out to touch the bobcat's head gently. "I swear to you, I'll take care of her. I'll raise her right, teach her to survive. I promise." The bobcat's eyes seemed to focus on his face with effort. For just a moment, Tommy could have sworn he saw understanding there, even gratitude. Then her breathing stopped, and the light faded from her golden gaze. Tommy sat in the rain beside her body until the paramedics arrived, one hand on the dead bobcat's neck, the other reaching toward the terrified kitten who would become his daughter in everything but blood. The EMTs found him like that, a broken man making promises to a creature who had died believing in the fundamental goodness of strangers. Later, after the hospital stay and the police reports, after the insurance adjusters and the tow truck drivers had done their work, Tommy returned to the crash site. He buried the bobcat mother beneath the cottonwood where she'd made her last stand, marking the grave with a cairn of red desert stones. "Your mama was a hero," he told the tiny kitten as she slept in his jacket pocket. "Don't you ever forget that she died believing in something bigger than herself, bigger than her own survival." That's a lesson worth remembering. Elder Joseph Thunderbird would later say that some debts transcend the boundary between species, that honor recognizes no difference between two-legged and four-legged souls. Tommy had been saved by love, and now love had claimed him in return. The circle that began with one mother's sacrifice would not be complete until another sacrifice was made, another debt was paid. But that was still 2 years in the future. For now, Tommy had a promise to keep and a daughter to raise, even if she happened to have spots and claws instead of smooth skin and tiny fingers. Love, he was learning, came in many forms, and sometimes the purest love came from the most unexpected places. "Love will find a way, even if it has to walk 50 miles, Jake Whitehorse muttered to himself as he watched the Bobcat pace frantically at the edge of the ravine. 3 hours had passed since Spirit had led them through some of the most treacherous terrain he'd encountered in 20 years of wilderness rescue, and now she was acting like her heart was breaking. The little cat had navigated with a precision that defied explanation, leading Jake and the emergency response team through narrow deer trails, across unstable scree slopes, and around hidden sinkholes that could have swallowed a man whole. She'd stopped frequently to look back, ensuring they were following, her golden eyes blazing with an urgency that spoke louder than any human words. But now, staring down into the rocky ravine where Tommy Redfeather lay trapped beneath a massive pine trunk, Jake understood why Spirit had been so desperate on the highway. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a race against time, and they were losing. "Tommy!" Jake called down into the shadowy depths. "Tommy Redfeather! Can you hear me?" A weak voice drifted up from below, barely audible over the wind whistling through the canyon walls. "Down here. I'm hurt pretty bad, Jake." The use of his first name surprised Jake until he remembered that Tommy's reputation in the wildlife rehabilitation community was legendary. Of course, Tommy would recognize his voice. Jake had consulted with him on countless animal emergencies over the years. But hearing that familiar voice coming from 40 feet below, weak with pain and exhaustion, hit him harder than he'd expected. "Hang tight, brother," Jake shouted back. "We're going to get you out of there. How bad are you hurt?" "Legs busted. Maybe some ribs, too. Been here since yesterday afternoon." Yesterday afternoon, Jake felt his stomach clench. That meant Tommy had been trapped for over 18 hours, exposed to the elements, probably going into shock. In these desert conditions, with nighttime temperatures dropping into the 40s, hypothermia was a real danger even in September. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the trauma physician who'd volunteered for the rescue, knelt beside Jake at the rim of the ravine. "We need to get down there fast," she said quietly. "If he's been down there that long, we're looking at serious dehydration, possible internal bleeding, and that's assuming he doesn't have head trauma from the fall." Jake nodded grimly and turned to address his team. The volunteer search and rescue squad had assembled quickly after his radio call, but this kind of technical rescue required specialized equipment and expertise. They'd need ropes, a stretcher designed for vertical extraction, and enough manpower to haul an injured man up 40 feet of loose rock. "When the going gets tough, the tough get going," he said, invoking one of his grandfather's favorite sayings. "Mike, I need you to rig a rappelling system on that big boulder. Sarah, get the rescue basket ready. Elena, you're coming down with me to assess his condition." As the team sprang into action, Jake noticed Spirit positioning herself at the exact point where the descent would be easiest. She'd found the one spot where the rock face offered natural handholds, where the footing was most stable. Even now, she was helping with the rescue. The descent took 20 minutes of careful rope work. Jake went first, testing each foothold before committing his weight. The rock was still slick from yesterday's storm, and loose stones clattered into the ravine with every step. Behind him, Dr. Rodriguez followed with a medical pack strapped to her back, her movements precise and confident, despite the challenging terrain. What they found at the bottom made Jake's heart sink. Tommy was conscious but clearly in serious trouble. His right leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, pinned beneath the fallen pine's massive trunk. His lips were cracked and pale, his eyes sunken with dehydration. Worst of all, Jake could see dark stains on the rocks around him. blood that had dried hours ago. "Well, I'll be damned," Tommy said with a weak smile as Jake knelt beside him. "Didn't expect to see you down here, partner." "Always did say you were too stubborn to die easy," Jake replied, trying to keep his voice light while Dr. Rodriguez began her examination. "What the hell happened up there?" Tommy's explanation came in short, painful bursts. The storm, the lightning strike, the tree falling. As he spoke, Jake noticed how Tommy's eyes kept tracking upward, searching for something. "Spirit," Tommy whispered. "Is she okay? Did she make it back?" "She's fine," Jake assured him. "Matter of fact, she's the one who brought us here." "That little cat walked 50 miles to find help, Tommy. 50 miles through some of the roughest country in Arizona." Tommy's eyes filled with tears. "She did it. I knew she would, but—" His voice broke. "I didn't think I'd live to see her again." Dr. Rodriguez finished her initial assessment and caught Jake's eye, shaking her head slightly. The message was clear. Tommy was in critical condition. Multiple fractures, possible internal bleeding, severe dehydration. They needed to get him to a hospital immediately. "Tommy, we're going to get you out of here," Jake said firmly. "But first we need to move this tree off your legs. It's going to hurt like hell." "Can't hurt worse than it already does," Tommy replied with gallows humor. "Do what you need to do." The next hour was a nightmare of carefully orchestrated teamwork. Using a system of ropes and pulleys, the rescue team managed to lift the pine trunk just enough for Jake and Dr. Rodriguez to drag Tommy clear. His screams echoed off the canyon walls, and at one point he passed out from the pain, but they got him free. Dr. Rodriguez worked quickly to stabilize him, starting an IV line and splinting his leg as best she could in the confined space. "We need to move him now," she told Jake. "His blood pressure's dropping. If we don't get him to surgery soon—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Jake had seen enough rescue operations go wrong to know what that meant. Getting Tommy up the ravine wall required another hour of dangerous work. They strapped him into a rescue basket and used a complex rigging system to haul him up foot by foot, while team members positioned themselves along the rock face to guide the basket around obstacles. Every bump and scrape drew moans of pain from their patient, but slowly, agonizingly, they made progress. Spirit watched the entire operation from her perch at the rim, never moving, never making a sound. Only when Tommy's stretcher finally reached the top did she approach, pressing her nose to his hand and making soft chirping sounds that seemed almost like words. "Hey, girl," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. "You did good. You did real good." The helicopter evacuation was a blur of rotor noise and controlled chaos. Tommy was loaded aboard the medical chopper with Dr. Rodriguez, while Jake and the rest of the team began the long hike back to their vehicles. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying Tommy toward the trauma center in Phoenix, Jake noticed Spirit standing alone on a rock outcropping, watching until the aircraft disappeared into the distance. Only then did Jake remember what Tommy had said about Spirit being ready for release. This was supposed to have been her final test, her transition from captivity to freedom. Instead, it had become something else entirely, a demonstration of loyalty and courage that defied everything science knew about wild animal behavior. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake said aloud, echoing his words from the highway. "Just when you think you've seen everything." As they packed up their equipment, Jake made a mental note to check on Spirit's welfare. Tommy would be in the hospital for weeks, maybe months. Someone would need to care for the bobcat who had just saved her adoptive father's life, who had proven that love truly could find a way across any distance through any obstacle. The rescue was over, but Jake had a feeling the real story was just beginning. "Sometimes miracles wear fur coats," Jake Whitehorse told his wife that evening, still trying to process what he'd witnessed. But the real miracle was only beginning to unfold. The emergency surgery at Phoenix General Hospital lasted 8 hours. Dr. Michael Harrison, The lead orthopedic surgeon had seen plenty of wilderness accidents, but Tommy Redfeather's case was particularly challenging. Multiple compound fractures in the right leg, 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and severe internal bleeding from a ruptured spleen. Any one of these injuries could have been fatal. Together, they represented a medical puzzle that would test every skill the trauma team possessed. "It's a miracle he survived 18 hours with these injuries," Dr. Harrison told Jake during a brief break between procedures. "Most people would have died from blood loss alone. This man has the constitution of a horse and the will to live of someone with everything to live for." Jake thought about Spirit, probably still wandering the wilderness near the crash site, waiting for Tommy to return. If only the doctor knew about the 4-legged reason Tommy had fought so hard to stay alive. The waiting room filled gradually as word spread through the tight-knit Native American community. Elder Joseph Thunderbird arrived first, his weathered face grave but unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting this call for months. Tommy's cousin David drove up from Tucson. Sarah Morningstar, who ran the local wildlife sanctuary, brought coffee and homemade fry bread for everyone. "How did they find him?" Elder Joseph asked Jake quietly. "The canyon country is vast. A man could disappear there forever." Jake told them about Spirit, about the incredible 50-mile journey, about the way she'd led the rescue team directly to Tommy's location. As he spoke, he watched the old man's expression change from concern to wonder to something approaching reverence. "The mother's debt," Elder Joseph murmured. "The circle closes." "What do you mean?" Elder Joseph's ancient eyes held depths of knowledge that made Jake feel like a child. "Tommy never told you about how he found that Bobcat kitten, about why he felt compelled to raise her?" Jake shook his head, and Elder Joseph began to speak in the measured cadence of a storyteller sharing sacred history. He told them about the car accident 2 years ago, about the mountain lion attack, about the mother Bobcat who had died protecting a stranger. By the time he finished, everyone in the waiting room was silent, absorbing the weight of what they'd heard. "A debt of honor ain't never forgotten," Sarah Morningstar said softly. "The daughter paid what the mother was owed." At 3 in the morning, Dr. Harrison finally emerged from surgery, his scrubs stained with blood but his expression cautiously optimistic. "He's stable," he announced to the exhausted group. "We've repaired the internal bleeding, set the leg fractures, and reinflated his lung. The next 48 hours will be critical, but if he can avoid infection, he should make a full recovery." Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "Can we see him?" "He's sedated and won't be conscious for several hours, but yes, family can visit briefly." As the group filed toward the intensive care unit, Jake lagged behind, pulling out his cell phone. He had calls to make, arrangements to handle. Someone needed to check on Spirit, make sure she had food and water while Tommy recovered. Someone needed to... "Jake," Elder Joseph's voice stopped him in the hallway. "There's something else you need to know about Tommy. Something he's been keeping from everyone." The old man's words hit Jake like cold water. "What kind of something?" "He's sick. Has been for months. The kind of sick that doesn't get better." Jake stared at him, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Tommy's weight loss over the past year, his increasing fatigue during their joint operations, the way he'd been pushing Spirit's training with unusual urgency. "Cancer?" Jake asked. Elder Joseph nodded gravely. "Same disease that took his father. He refused treatment, wanted to focus on preparing Spirit for independence. This wilderness trip was supposed to be their goodbye." The revelation reframed everything Jake thought he understood about the rescue. Tommy hadn't just been fighting to survive a wilderness accident. He'd been fighting to live long enough to ensure Spirit's future. And Spirit, with whatever mysterious intuition animals possessed, had somehow known that her human father needed help beyond what normal training could provide. Jake spent the next 3 days coordinating Spirit's care while Tommy drifted in and out of consciousness. The Bobcat had remained near the crash site, as if waiting for some sign that her mission had been successful. Wildlife officials wanted to tranquilize her and move her to a facility, but Jake convinced them to let him try a different approach. On the 4th day, when Tommy was finally alert enough for visitors, Jake brought him a proposition that would have sounded insane to anyone who hadn't witnessed Spirit's loyalty firsthand. "She won't leave the canyon," Jake reported, sitting beside Tommy's hospital bed. "Fish and Wildlife wants to capture her, but I think she's waiting for word from you. What if we brought her here?" Tommy's eyes, still clouded with pain medication, focused with surprising intensity. "Here? To the hospital? Hear me out. The rehabilitation wing has an outdoor courtyard, double-fenced, secure. Sarah Morningstar says she can get temporary permits for educational purposes. Spirit could stay close while you recover, and you could oversee her transition to independence from here." "It ain't over till it's over," Tommy said with a weak smile, using one of his grandfather's favorite phrases. "But Jake, there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you before." Tommy's confession about his cancer diagnosis came haltingly, interrupted by coughing fits and long pauses to gather strength. By the time he finished, Jake understood why the rescue had felt like more than just a wilderness emergency. It had been a race against two different kinds of death. "Why didn't you tell someone?" Jake asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. "Because then it would have been about me dying instead of about Spirit living," Tommy replied. "She needed someone focused on her future, not my past." That afternoon, Jake made a series of phone calls that challenged every regulation in the book. Hospital administrators, wildlife officials, insurance companies, everyone had objections to bringing a wild bobcat onto hospital grounds. But Jake had spent 20 years building relationships in the bureaucracy, and he called in every favor he'd ever earned. The breakthrough came when Dr. Sarah Moonwalker, Tommy's oncologist, arrived for her consultation. After examining Tommy and reviewing his refusal of treatment, she made an observation that changed everything. "You know, there's emerging research about animal-assisted therapy for terminal patients," she told the assembled hospital staff. "If Mr. Redfeather's emotional well-being is improved by proximity to this animal, it could actually benefit his physical recovery. Stress reduction, improved immune function, better pain management through natural endorphin release." Within hours, the paperwork was approved. Spirit would be transported to Phoenix General Hospital's rehabilitation courtyard, where she could remain close to Tommy while he recovered from surgery and made decisions about his cancer treatment. The reunion took place on a sunny Thursday morning that Jake would remember for the rest of his life. Spirit arrived in a specially modified transport crate, sedated but alert, her golden eyes scanning the unfamiliar environment with typical feline wariness. But the moment she saw Tommy through the courtyard window, everything changed. The bobcat's plaintive cries echoed off the hospital walls as she paced along the fence line closest to his window. Tommy, still confined to a wheelchair but finally strong enough for extended visits, was rolled out to the courtyard's observation area. The moment Spirit saw him clearly, she pressed herself against the fence, making soft, chirping sounds that seemed almost like words. "Hey, girl," Tommy whispered, reaching through the fence to touch her spotted fur. "You did it. You saved the old man." Spirit rubbed against his hand with purring intensity, and for the first time since the accident, Jake saw Tommy smile with genuine happiness. Whatever happened next, whatever decisions needed to be made about treatment and Spirit's future, this moment made it all worthwhile. The miracle hadn't been the rescue itself, it had been the love that made the rescue possible. "The truth has a way of coming out," Elder Joseph Thunderbird said quietly as he watched Tommy through the hospital window, and Jake was about to discover just how prophetic those words would be. It was Dr. Sarah Moonwalker who dropped the first bombshell during what was supposed to be a routine follow-up consultation. Tommy had been at Phoenix General for a week, his surgical wounds healing well, his spirits lifted by daily visits with Spirit in the courtyard. Jake had been feeling cautiously optimistic about his friend's recovery when Dr. Moonwalker asked to speak with him privately. "Mr. Whitehorse, I need to discuss something with you about Tommy's condition," she began, her professional demeanor barely concealing deeper concerns. "Are you aware that he has pancreatic cancer?" Jake nodded grimly. "Elder Joseph told me. Tommy finally admitted it himself a few days ago. What he may not have told you is the extent of his condition. The cancer is stage 3, possibly stage 4. Without treatment, he has perhaps 3 months left. With aggressive intervention, we might extend that to 18 months, but the quality of life would be severely compromised." The weight of her words settled over Jake like a shroud. He'd known Tommy was sick, but hearing the timeline stated so bluntly made it real in a way that abstract knowledge couldn't match. "What kind of aggressive intervention are we talking about? Chemotherapy, possible radiation therapy, surgical resection if the tumor hasn't spread too extensively? But Jake, there's something else. Something that complicates everything." Dr. Moonwalker pulled up a series of medical images on her tablet. "These are CT scans from Tommy's emergency surgery. Look at this." She pointed to a dark shadow in Tommy's abdomen, clearly visible against the lighter tissue surrounding it. "The tumor has grown significantly since his last scan 6 months ago. But here's what's interesting and deeply concerning." She swiped to another image. "This is from yesterday. The tumor appears to have hemorrhaged during his fall. There's internal bleeding that we managed to control surgically, but it's created an urgent situation." Jake studied the scans, trying to understand what he was seeing. "What does that mean for his treatment options?" "It means he needs to start chemotherapy immediately if he wants any chance of survival. The hemorrhaging has accelerated his timeline. Without intervention, we're looking at weeks, not months." The consultation room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in as Jake processed this information. "Have you told Tommy?" "I've tried. He keeps deflecting, changing the subject to Spirit's welfare. It's as if he's made peace with dying, but he can't bear the thought of that Bobcat being alone." Dr. Moonwalker's professional facade cracked slightly. "In 30 years of oncology practice, I've never seen someone so focused on another creature's welfare while facing their own mortality." That afternoon, Jake sat in the courtyard watching Tommy work with Spirit through the fence. The Bobcat was noticeably pregnant now, her sides rounded with the promise of new life. Jake had noticed the signs days ago, but hadn't wanted to add another complication to an already complex situation. Now, watching Tommy's gentle interactions with his 4-legged daughter, Jake realized the pregnancy might be the key to everything. "Tommy," he said carefully, "we need to talk about Spirit's condition." Tommy looked up from where he'd been offering Spirit treats through the fence. "What do you mean?" "She seems healthy enough. She's pregnant, brother. Has been for a while now. I'd guess she's got maybe 2 weeks before those cubs arrive." The news hit Tommy like a physical blow. He sank back in his wheelchair, staring at Spirit with new understanding. "Pregnant," he whispered. "No wonder she was so determined to save me. She wasn't just thinking about herself." "Tommy, there's something else we need to discuss. Something about your cancer treatment." But before Jake could continue, they were interrupted by an unexpected visitor. A tall man in his 50s approached the courtyard, wearing the uniform of the Arizona Department of Fish and Wildlife. Jake recognized him immediately. Director Robert Clearwater, Elder Joseph's nephew, and one of the most respected wildlife officials in the state. "Tommy Redfeather," Director Clearwater said with a slight smile. I've been hearing some remarkable stories about you and your Bobcat friend. Tommy struggled to sit straighter in his wheelchair. Director Clearwater, I wasn't expecting... Call me Bob, and don't worry, you're not in trouble. Actually, I'm here with a proposition that might interest you. He gestured toward Spirit, who was watching the conversation with typical feline alertness. That animal has created quite a stir in wildlife circles. Her rescue mission has been documented, verified, and frankly, it's generated more positive publicity for wildlife conservation than anything we've done in years. Jake felt a familiar tension building. In his experience, when government officials started talking about publicity and propositions, it usually meant someone was about to lose something they valued. What kind of proposition? Tommy asked warily. We want to offer Spirit a permanent home at the new Arizona Wildlife Education Center, full-time staff, state-of-the-art facilities, and most importantly, she'd become an ambassador for bobcat conservation. Her story could help protect thousands of acres of critical habitat. Tommy's expression darkened. She's not a publicity stunt, Bob. She's family. Which is exactly why this could work, Director Clearwater continued smoothly. We're not talking about a traditional zoo situation. We're talking about a partnership. You'd oversee her care, develop educational programs, help train the next generation of wildlife rehabilitators. Think of it as expanding your life's work rather than ending it. The offer hung in the air between them, and Jake could see Tommy weighing the implications. It would solve the immediate problem of Spirit's care, provide financial security, and ensure her cubs would have proper veterinary attention. But it would also mean acknowledging that Tommy's time was running out. A man's got to know his limitations, Tommy said finally, invoking one of his grandfather's favorite phrases. But he's also got to know when opportunity knocks. That evening, as Jake helped Tommy back to his hospital room, they were met by Dr. Moonwalker with news that shifted everything once again. Tommy, I've been reviewing your case with the surgical team, and we need to discuss something urgent. She led them to a private conference room where several other medical professionals were waiting. The hemorrhaging from your fall has created an unexpected opportunity, Dr. Moonwalker began. The bleeding helped expose the tumor boundaries more clearly. Dr. Martinez here is one of the country's leading pancreatic surgeons, and he believes we might be able to attempt a surgical resection. Dr. Martinez, a serious man with kind eyes, leaned forward. It's a risky procedure, Tommy, but if successful, combined with targeted chemotherapy, we could be looking at years instead of months. The catch is, we need to operate within the next week, before the cancer spreads further. Tommy listened to the medical explanation with the same calm attention he'd always given to complex wildlife cases. When the doctors finished, he asked only one question. How long would I be hospitalized? How long before I could care for Spirit and her cubs? Assuming no complications, you'd be here for 3 weeks minimum, Dr. Martinez replied. Recovery would take several months. Jake watched Tommy process this information, seeing the conflict play out across his weathered features. The surgery offered hope for extended life, but it also meant abandoning Spirit during the most critical period of her motherhood. I need time to think, Tommy said finally, and I need to talk to Spirit. That night, Jake found Tommy in the courtyard despite hospital regulations about after-hours visits. Spirit was pacing restlessly in her enclosure, her pregnancy making movement uncomfortable. Tommy sat in his wheelchair pressed against the fence, one hand extended through the chain link to touch her fur. She's scared, Tommy said without looking up. First time I've ever seen her truly frightened. She knows something's changing, something beyond her control. Jake settled into a nearby chair, choosing his words carefully. Maybe she's not the only one who's scared. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, his fingers moving gently through Spirit's fur. You know what the hardest part is, Jake? It's not the dying. I made peace with that months ago. It's the living. The possibility that I might have enough time left to matter to build something lasting. The wildlife center position? That, the surgery, the chance to see Spirit's cubs grow up. Tommy's voice cracked slightly. What if I choose to fight and end up dying anyway, but worse? Dying slowly, suffering while she watches. What if I choose the quick path and miss the chance to give her everything she deserves? As if responding to her name, Spirit pressed closer to the fence, her golden eyes reflecting the courtyard lights. In that moment, Jake understood that this wasn't really a choice between life and death. It was a choice between different kinds of love, different ways of honoring the bond between a man and the wild creature who had saved his life. The answer, when it came, would surprise everyone. Family ain't always blood. Sometimes it's love that chooses to stay, Tommy Redfeather said to his assembled loved ones 3 days later, and with those words he changed the trajectory of multiple lives forever. The decision hadn't come easily. Tommy had spent sleepless nights in his hospital bed, wrestling with choices that seemed to offer no perfect answers. Fight the cancer aggressively, and risk dying slowly while Spirit watched him suffer? Accept his fate and abandon her during the most vulnerable time of her life? Or find a third path that honored both his mortality and their unbreakable bond? The answer came during Spirit's labor. Jake had been dozing in the courtyard visitor's chair when Spirit's distressed cries woke him at 2 a.m. Through the fence, he could see her pacing frantically, clearly in the early stages of delivery, but unable to find a comfortable position in the sterile enclosure. Her golden eyes kept seeking Tommy through the hospital windows, as if she needed his presence to feel safe enough to bring her cubs into the world. "Get Tommy," Jake told the night nurse. "I don't care about hospital regulations. That animal needs him." 20 minutes later, Tommy arrived in his wheelchair, still wearing his hospital gown over hastily pulled-on clothes. The moment Spirit saw him, her agitation calmed. She settled into the corner of her enclosure closest to the fence where Tommy could reach through and touch her. "Easy, girl," Tommy murmured, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he'd used to calm frightened animals for 15 years. "I'm here. We're gonna do this together." Spirit's labor lasted 6 hours, and Tommy never left her side. Jake watched, amazed, as the dying man coached his Bobcat daughter through one of nature's most primal experiences. When the first cub emerged, a tiny, spotted replica of her mother, Tommy's tears reflected the courtyard lights like stars. "Look at that," he whispered. "Look at what you did, Spirit. You brought hope into the world." 2 more cubs followed, each one healthy and perfect. As dawn broke over Phoenix, Spirit lay contentedly with her babies, occasionally looking toward Tommy as if seeking his approval. In that moment, watching new life emerge while contemplating his own mortality, Tommy found the clarity he'd been seeking. That afternoon, he called a meeting that would reshape everyone's understanding of what family could mean. Elder Joseph Thunderbird arrived first, his ancient eyes taking in the scene of Spirit nursing her cubs while Tommy watched protectively from his wheelchair. Dr. Sarah Moonwalker came next, followed by Director Robert Clearwater, Jake, and several nurses who had become invested in this unusual patient story. "I've made my decision about the surgery," Tommy began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to propose. "I'm going to have the operation, but not for the reasons you might think." Dr. Moonwalker leaned forward. "Tommy, that's wonderful news. We can schedule—" "Let me finish," Tommy interrupted gently. "I'm having the surgery, and I'm accepting the position at the Wildlife Education Center. But I'm also accepting that this cancer is going to win eventually. The surgery buys me time, maybe a year, maybe 2 if we're lucky. And I want to use that time to build something that will outlast me." He gestured toward Spirit and her cubs. "These little ones are going to need more than just one person looking after them. They're going to need a community, a support system that can function whether I'm here or not. Elder Joseph nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his weathered features. You're talking about creating a legacy, not just extending a life. Exactly. The Wildlife Center position gives me resources and staff. The surgery gives me time to train them properly. But most importantly, it gives me the chance to build a program that will continue caring for animals like Spirit long after I'm gone. Tommy's proposal was ambitious and heartbreaking in equal measure. He would undergo the risky surgery, knowing it might fail. He would endure months of chemotherapy, knowing it would weaken him. He would accept the position at the Wildlife Education Center and spend whatever time he had left building a comprehensive wildlife rehabilitation program. And he would do it all while raising Spirit's cubs and preparing them for lives that balanced wildness with human connection. It's not about beating cancer, Tommy explained. It's about beating meaninglessness. If I die in 6 months, at least I'll die knowing that Spirit and her babies have a future and that other animals will benefit from what we've learned together. The surgery took place 2 weeks later. Dr. Martinez and his team worked for 9 hours, removing what they could of the tumor and clearing as much of the cancer as possible. The procedure was successful beyond their most optimistic projections. They'd managed to remove 90% of the tumor, buying Tommy significantly more time than anyone had dared hope. Recovery was brutal. The chemotherapy that followed sapped Tommy's strength and left him nauseated and exhausted. But every day, no matter how sick he felt, he insisted on visiting Spirit and her cubs. Watching them grow, seeing their eyes open, witnessing their first tentative steps, observing Spirit teaching them essential survival skills, gave him a reason to endure the medical ordeal. Jake became an unofficial part of the care team, taking over feeding duties when Tommy was too weak to hold a bottle. Elder Joseph visited daily, sharing traditional stories with the cubs as if they were human grandchildren. Even the hospital staff found themselves emotionally invested in this unusual, extended family. 3 months after the surgery, Tommy was strong enough to begin work at the Wildlife Education Center. The facility's director had designed a special position around Tommy's unique situation, part educator, part program developer, part ambassador for the deep connections possible between humans and wildlife. Tommy's office overlooked a spacious enclosure where Spirit and her cubs could live semi-wild lives while still receiving the care they needed. The cubs, named Hope, Faith, and Charity by the local schoolchildren who followed their story, grew into healthy, intelligent animals that embodied their mother's unusual relationship with humans. They were wild enough to survive on their own if necessary, but socialized enough to serve as ambassadors for their species. Tommy's cancer remained in remission for 18 months, longer than anyone had predicted. During that time, he trained a new generation of wildlife rehabilitators, developed protocols for caring for animals with complex human bonds, and created educational programs that reached thousands of children. But perhaps most importantly, he proved that love could create families that transcended species boundaries. When the cancer finally returned, Tommy faced it with the same quiet dignity he'd brought to every challenge in his life. He arranged for Spirit and her adult cubs to be cared for by the team he'd trained. He established a trust fund to ensure the Wildlife Education Center could continue its work, and he spent his final weeks surrounded by the creatures and people who had made his last years meaningful. Tommy died on a Tuesday morning in October, with Spirit's head resting on his chest and her grown cubs nearby. Jake, who had become the unofficial guardian of this unusual family, was holding Tommy's hand when he took his last breath. "Home is where the heart is," Jake whispered, using one of Tommy's favorite sayings as a benediction. 6 months later, the Thomas Redfeather Wildlife Rehabilitation Center hosted its grand opening. Spirit, now a grandmother to Hope's own cubs, served as the ceremony's guest of honor. She had adapted to her role as an ambassador with the same grace she'd shown in every other aspect of her remarkable life. During the dedication ceremony, Elder Joseph Thunderbird spoke about the interconnectedness of all living things, about how love creates bonds that death cannot break. As he spoke, Spirit's great-grand cubs played in the background, their antics drawing laughter from the assembled crowd. Jake often reflected on the chain of events that had brought them all together. A car accident that created a debt of honor, a rescue mission that defied natural law, a man's decision to choose love over fear in the face of terminal illness. But perhaps the most remarkable thing was how the story continued to unfold, each generation of cubs carrying forward the legacy of trust and cooperation their great-grandmother had established. When they asked me what Tommy Redfeather's greatest accomplishment was, Jake told visitors to the center, I don't talk about the animals he saved or the programs he created. I talk about how he proved that family is what you make it, and love is what you give it. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the smallest teachers, and sometimes those teachers happen to have spots and whiskers. Spirit lived to be 12 years old, ancient for a bobcat, surrounded by 3 generations of descendants and the human family that had chosen to stay. Her legacy lived on in the Wildlife Education Center, in the rehabilitation protocols Tommy had developed, and in the countless animals whose lives were saved by the programs they had built together. But mostly, her legacy lived on in the simple truth that love recognizes no boundaries, asks for no conditions, and creates miracles in the most unexpected places. Tommy Redfeather's story reminds us that our greatest legacy isn't measured in years lived, but in love given. At 43, facing terminal cancer, Tommy could have chosen bitterness or despair. Instead, he chose to pour his remaining time into raising Spirit, a bobcat orphan who would later walk 50 miles to save his life. Their bond proves that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the love that chooses to stay, even when staying means sacrifice. Tommy's decision to undergo painful treatment wasn't about extending his own life, but about building something lasting for the creatures he loved. He transformed his diagnosis from a death sentence into a mission statement, creating the Wildlife Education Center that continues saving animals today. In our golden years, we often worry about being forgotten or becoming burdens. But Tommy shows us that purpose doesn't expire with age or health. It evolves. His legacy lives on in every rescued animal, every child who learns to respect wildlife, every person who discovers that love creates miracles in unexpected places. Whether we're 55 or 85, we all have something precious to give, some spirit waiting for our guidance, some legacy begging to be born from our accumulated wisdom and boundless capacity to love. What legacy are you building with your remaining years? Have you ever experienced an unexpected bond with an animal that changed your perspective on family and love? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might inspire someone else to find their own spirit.